Hello again, this is Rabbi Dr. Juan Bejarano Gutierrez, and we're going to continue with our short but interesting review of differences between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. We're only focusing in on some issues that I think are interesting. Today we're going to look at the issue of polygamy, because in most Jewish circles, certainly in the West, there's an assumption that polygamy was outlawed, if you will, or prohibited since the medieval period by the Takanah of Rabbi Gershom. And what we find, in fact, is that the Takanah, the edict that was issued by Rabbi Gershom, was not applied within the Iberian Peninsula, certainly not in the majority of it, or in Sephardic diaspora communities of North Africa, those that emerged in the Ottoman Empire or were part of the Ottoman Empire. And so it's interesting because this issue is ultimately dealt with in a different way. And in fact, I came across this a couple months ago because I did a wedding in a small town for a couple, and they had a Sephardic ketubah. In most of the cases I've done, they actually have Ashkenazic ketubas, sort of standard Americanized ketubot. But in this case, it was a Sephardic couple, and they had the clause that we'll talk about that addresses this issue. Now, let me get to the slide here just very quickly. Well, some elements here that I think will be somewhat surprising, but it's, again, part of our historical review. So the Takanah of Rabbi Gershom prohibiting polygamy was not generally in effect in the Iberian Peninsula, or what we would call Spain and Portugal, nor in the Sephardic diaspora communities, as I mentioned, following the expulsion. In fact, it's interesting in the Ottoman Empire, where many Sephardic Jews from Spain and Portugal, emigrated to and settled in large numbers and became the basis for some of the very large Jewish communities in Thessalonica, for example, Istanbul, and so forth. Many Ashkenazim who came in actually assimilated into the dominant Sephardic culture. In fact, it's interesting, if you come across somebody whose last name is Ashkenazi or Eshkenazi, usually those individuals are Sephardic. In fact, I don't think I've ever met anybody whose last name is Ashkenazi or Ashkenazi who's actually Ashkenazic, but they are Ashkenazic. It's just that their families came into Sephardic communities, they were absorbed, they became Sephardic, if you will, and they retained that name sort of as an identifier. So it's an interesting history in and of itself. But as a consequence, the fact that in Islam, of course, in the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and so forth, polygamy was something that was acceptable. So it was inevitable in that sense that it would not affect the Jewish community. I mean, this is the cultural context, right? We talked about I think in the first video about the Arabization of the Iberian Peninsula. And again, I'm not justifying that, but I'm just simply saying that from a cultural context, you can understand why this would have continued at some level. Now, I didn't know that it was very widespread, but it was certainly something that was not prohibited, as most people assume, and was the case in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, the Tanakh itself, the Bible, permits it, quote unquote, because there are many examples of polygamy. In all the cases, I think it's clear that there's always a tremendous amount of pain and suffering and difficulties that arise, and in sibling rivalry. I mean, we have many, many examples of this. But again, from a legal standpoint, we have to recognize that it was not something that was prohibited, and that's important. So the cultural context and also the Tanakh itself is something that is important to note. Now, in Sephardic circles, it's ultimately dealt with by the insertion of a clause in the ketubah itself, and this is really I think the differentiating element between the Ashkenazic perspective and the general Sephardic perspective, and that is that it's an agreement that's made between the husband and the wife, or the bride and the to be and the groom, that this is something that they want inserted into the ketubah. And in fact, that ketubah that I filled out a few months ago included that clause, and it said that the groom was testifying, swearing that he would not sanctify or take another woman aside from, of course, the woman that was mentioned in the ketubah itself. And it's interesting because I think in many ways the blanket approach of the Takanah maybe illustrates a very different perspective. The Sephardic community seemed to allow the individual couple to make that determination. And of course, that's, again, in our society, that is something that is done, and we have to take into account the basic realities of the law of the land and the illegality of this. Now, there's another element that also needs to be explicated or discussed, and it may be somewhat shocking to people, but it's important, again, to be intellectually honest and historically honest. In the case of Rabbi Gershom, it's important to note that Christianity rejected outright polygamy. Now, individuals might have paramours, they might have many individuals that they were involved with, but a legal marriage was something that was prohibited. And as a consequence, we can't ignore the likelihood that Christian perceptions on polygamy affected the Ashkenazi community. And as we said from the very beginning, in the lands of Ashkenaz, with Jews being the only major minority, they are going to be the focus of attention. And this is something that they cannot afford. I mean, it makes perfect sense in Islamic dominated countries where the cultural context is, of course, very different. The ability of this practice to survive, it makes sense, at least until the early modern period. What's interesting, of course, is also this issue that in Spain or in the Iberian Peninsula, apparently some Sephardim continued with the biblical description of concubinage, or the pilgesh, which is sort of a status of marriage, one might say, without a ketubah. I mean, there's different discussions about it historically, about exactly what the conditions of that were. I mean, there's a rabbinic perspective and there's also a historical perspective. But this is something that appears to have continued in some form in the Iberian Peninsula. And there's an interesting, and again, might be disturbing situation for some, but the purpose here is to be historically accurate. In some Jewish communities in the Iberian Peninsula, there was a great concern for individuals that were seeking intimacy, for lack of a better word, outside of marriage. And there were some communities that apparently had, women who were, you might say, sustained by the community officially for these purposes, prostitution. And the reason for this was the concern that Jews would go to Christian women. And aside from the moral issues, which I think, of course, from a traditional halakhic perspective are very problematic, the issue had to do with the mixing of Jews and non-Jews, because from the dominant, when the political situation in the Iberian Peninsula changed, the act of a Jew being intimate with a non-Jew was something that could really erupt into very dangerous circumstances for the community as a whole. Now, in Ashkenazic circles, that seems to have been rejected from the very beginning, or at least for most part, as we know. And that seems to have drawn a measure of praise from several Christians, or at least many Christians that we know, who write about Jews, at least their impressions of Jews. So it's interesting. Again, it's a different context historically. I'm not justifying that practice in any way, but I think it's important for us to make sure that we understand that the cultural context, in terms of Islamic culture and Christian culture, were very important in the shaping of Jewish practices and ideas.